The chair came down before anyone had time to gasp. 1 second, the reunion was filled with the scrape of plates and the clink of glasses, and the next, it was filled with the crack of wood slamming into bone. My father had risen without warning, his hand gripping the back of the heavy wooden chair he had been sitting on, and he swung it as if it weighed nothing. The impact threw me sideways into the wall. The framed photograph I had been holding slipped from my hands and shattered across the floor glass, scattering beneath the table where children sat frozen with half-eaten rolls in their mouths. The sound was louder than any firework, louder than any slammed door, louder than my own breath leaving my lungs in a ragged burst. For a second, I thought the roof itself had caved in. Pain shot through my shoulder and rib cage. I slid to the ground, stunned, airless, the world tilting in and out of focus. Around me, forks hung suspended in mid-air, conversations cut off mid-word. The smell of roast turkey and beer turned bitter in my throat. No one moved. No one spoke. My father stood in the center of the room, still holding the chair, his chest heaving, his face red, the veins in his neck standing out like cords. His eyes searched the room, daring anyone to challenge him, demanding the silence he had been fed all his life. It was given to him again. Every face around the long table turned toward their plates, toward their cups, toward the floor. Only Emma did not. My niece let out a cry that pierced the stunned silence, high and sharp, a sound of pure terror. She spilled her juice as she ran small sneakers slipping on the polished floor, and she flung herself at me where I sat crumpled, her tiny arms wrapped around my waist, her tears soaking through my dress. I felt her shaking against me, and in that moment, through the haze of pain, I recognized it. It was the same shudder I had carried as a child when footsteps thundered down the hall, the same flinch that lived in my muscles for years. She was living my past in real time, and everyone in that room could see it. My father still held the chair, as if he might swing again. The silence of the family was thicker than smoke. My mother's lips pressed together in a thin white line, her hands clenched in her lap. Uncles and aunts shifted uncomfortably. Cousins stared at their food. Not one person rose. Not one person said, "Stop." My own breath came in shallow bursts as I pulled Emma closer, feeling the sting of broken glass against my leg, the sharp edge of wood where the chair had struck me. I looked up at my father. He expected fear. He expected pleading, but I gave him nothing. I held his gaze with the same silence that had enraged him moments earlier. For a long beat, it was just us, the abuser, standing tall with his weapon, and the daughter he had tried for decades to break, kneeling on the floor bleeding but unbent. And then the moment stretched wider, pulling in the whole room, every relative who had chosen to look away. The chair trembled in his grip. His breath grew ragged. Emma's sobs filled the hall where laughter had been a heartbeat before. The reunion meant to celebrate family had become a stage for the violence that had always lurked beneath our name. The curtain was up, the audience was captive, and this time I knew the performance would not end the way he expected. The room had not yet recovered from the sound of the chair when another sound broke through, steady and deliberate, the scrape of a chair pushed back by someone who refused to remain seated. It was my Uncle Robert, though no one in the family called him that anymore. To most of us, he was Dr. Robert Hale, a retired physician who had once stitched up my forehead after my father threw me into a doorframe, a man who had carried suspicions for years but rarely voiced them in public. He stood now, tall despite his age, and raised his hand. Enough, he said, his voice carrying with the same authority it had in hospital corridors. "No one touches her." His eyes swept the room, daring anyone to ignore him. "Call 911, he ordered, and for once the family's paralysis cracked. A younger cousin fumbled for his phone, stammering as he dialed. My father froze the chair, still hanging awkwardly in his grip, caught between fury and the dawning realization that this moment was not collapsing back into silence the way it always had before. Robert stepped forward. "This is not the first time," he said clearly, his voice aimed at every witness in the room. "Years ago, I saw the X-rays, broken ribs, a fractured wrist. I treated her injuries myself. You all remember the stories he told to cover them. She fell. She tripped. She was clumsy. Lies. The word hung heavy, undeniable. My father's face twisted, a storm of denial forming, but before he could speak, the front door opened with a sharp click that sliced through the tension like glass. A woman stepped inside. Her posture composed, a folder tucked beneath her arm. The silver badge pinned to her jacket read, Child Protective Services. She was not part of this family, not tangled in its excuses or its shame, and that was precisely what gave her power. Her eyes swept the scene, me on the floor, with Emma clinging tight. Robert standing firm, my father still clutching the chair, and a room full of relatives pretending to vanish into the wallpaper. She spoke with calm precision. Mr. Hale, she addressed Robert with a nod. Thank you for your call. Then she turned to my father. Sir, I need you to put the chair down now. He laughed, a harsh bark that cracked in his throat. This is a private matter, he said. We handle our own. Her tone did not shift. Not anymore. There have been reports. We are here for your granddaughter's safety, and now we have witnessed enough. My mother leapt to her feet at last, her voice shrill. This is family. You cannot come in here and accuse him. She turned to the agent as if expecting intimidation to work, but the agent did not even glance at her. She fixed her gaze on my father and repeated, Put it down. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he lowered the chair. The wooden legs scraped the floor as it settled, and in that sound I heard the crumbling of years of untouchable rage. Robert crossed his arms. You all see it now, he said to the relatives who still stared at their plates. You cannot unsee it. The CPS agent stepped closer, calm but immovable. We will need to speak with everyone here. And with that, the silence of complicity fractured. The reunion was no longer a family gathering. It was an intervention wrapped in truth, and for the first time in my life, the law itself had walked through the door. People would later ask why I had gone at all. Why I had stepped back into a house where every scar on my body had been born, why I would risk walking into the lion's den when I could have stayed away. The truth was, I had not come to make peace. I had not come to rebuild bonds or share a meal. I came because silence had never saved me, and I could see it beginning to devour Emma. 2 months earlier, I had noticed the faint purple ring around her wrist when she reached for a cup of water. She said she had fallen, her eyes darting away, the same excuse I had whispered 100 times as a girl. My stomach had twisted because I recognized the shape of the bruise. It was not from falling. It was from being gripped too tightly by a man who used his hands as weapons. That night, I sat in my apartment and pulled out the folder I had built slowly over the years, a file I had told myself I might never use. Inside were photographs of my own injuries, taken in secret, labeled with dates. Pages of hospital records, diagnoses of sprains and fractures I had been told to lie about. Printouts of text messages filled with threats and curses. Every piece of evidence I had kept was a seed I hoped would never be needed. But hope is fragile when history repeats itself. I thought of Emma small and quiet, her shoulders already curling inward like mine used to, and I knew I had to act. I reached out to Robert first. He had been the only one who had ever looked at me with suspicion when I said I had fallen. His hands had touched my broken skin with the gentleness of someone who knew the difference between accident and assault. He listened as I told him everything. For a long time he was silent. Then he said, I believe you, and I believe it is happening again. His words were both a relief and a blade cutting open wounds I had kept closed. He agreed to support me to step in if I needed him, and he contacted Child Protective Services with his own statement. From that point forward, there was no turning back. The reunion was already scheduled, an annual tradition of forced smiles and heavy drinking. I knew my father would be there, and I knew alcohol would strip what little restraint he pretended to have. I did not hope for a fight, but I expected it. I told myself if it happened in front of everyone, no one could deny it anymore. It would not be just my word against his. It would be the truth carved into the memory of every relative present. That was why I walked into the hall carrying not only the faded photograph, but also the weight of my decision. I was not naive. I knew my family might turn against me even harder. I knew they might call me dramatic, a liar, a destroyer of gatherings. But I also knew that if Emma grew up watching everyone excuse his violence, she would learn to excuse it too in herself, in others, and the cycle would tighten like a noose. I had carried that noose for decades. I was not going to watch it slip around her neck, so I came. I came prepared. I came knowing this was not about reconciliation. It was about confrontation. It was about showing the next generation that silence is not safety. And as I lay on the floor of the reunion hall with Emma clinging to me and glass shards biting into my skin, I realized I had been right. The confrontation had found us, and this time I was not alone. When I was Emma's age, the house I lived in was filled with the same silence that wrapped itself around the reunion hall after the chair struck me. It was the silence of compliance of people who chose to pretend that nothing was wrong because pretending was easier than admitting the truth. My father's rage was a weather system that ruled every day. When he was calm, we all breathed easier, but when the clouds gathered in his eyes, everyone scattered like animals sensing a storm. I remember the first time he hit me clearly, not because of the pain, but because of the way the room reacted. I was 7, I had spilled milk across the table, and his hand shot out faster than my eyes could blink. My cheek burned, my ears rang, and I waited for my mother to scoop me up to say it was too much. Instead, she said, "You know how he gets," and she told me to apologize. I did not because I believed I was wrong, but because I understood that in our house, apology was a survival tactic, a way to keep the storm from destroying more than one room at a time. That pattern repeated until it carved itself into my bones. Broken glass swept under rugs. Bruises explained away as playground accidents. Neighbors assured that the noise they heard was only a television turned too loud. My father's violence was not random. It was targeted, precise, meant to control. If I talked back, he slammed me into walls. If I cried, he shook me until I learned to cry without sound. If I dared to laugh when his mood was dark, he smashed plates to remind me that joy had no place without his permission. My mother played her part as much as he did. She wrapped his violence in excuses like a gift no one wanted but everyone had to accept. She said he was tired, he was stressed, he was drinking too much. She said I provoked him. She said if I could only be quieter, more obedient, things would be better. The message sank into me deeper than the bruises. You are the cause. You are the problem. You are the troublemaker. The word became a curse that followed me into school. Teachers scolded me for daydreaming, for staring at the floor instead of raising my hand. Classmates whispered that I was strange. They never knew I had spent the night before curled in a closet listening to furniture break, holding my breath so tightly my chest ached. By the time I was 12, I had already become skilled at invisibility. I wore long sleeves and summer makeup too heavy for my age, and I told lies with practiced ease. The lies tasted like ash in my mouth, but they kept people from asking questions I knew they would not want the real answers to. And when questions did slip through, when a teacher once asked why I limped, my mother appeared like a shadow and said I was clumsy. The teacher nodded, the conversation ended, and the silence sealed itself again. I look back now and see how deep the rot went. My father believed anger was strength. My mother believed silence was loyalty, and together they created a home where pain was normal. I learned not to trust my own feelings. When I flinched, I was told I was dramatic. When I begged for help, I was told I was selfish. When I accused him, I was told I was lying. That gaslighting shaped me into someone who doubted every instinct, someone who second-guessed even the most obvious truths. And yet, there was a part of me that refused to die, a part that kept track, that stored memories like evidence, even before I knew that was what I was doing. I remembered the sound of his boots when he paced before striking the sour smell of beer on his breath, the way my mother's eyes darted anywhere but toward me. Those details built a ledger inside me, one that could not be erased by their words. Still, I survived by shrinking. I spoke only when asked. I disappeared into corners. I became a ghost in my own home. I thought if I was small enough, if I made myself invisible, he would forget to hurt me. But invisibility does not erase violence. It only makes it easier for others to ignore. By the time I was 16, I knew every trick to hide injury. I taped my ribs myself. I cleaned blood from carpet before my mother came home. I walked into school with a smile stretched so tight my face ached. No one saw me. Not truly. And that was the worst wound of all. Emma has begun to wear that same mask. I see it when she tries to laugh too quickly after being scolded when her shoulders tense, as footsteps approach when her voice drops to a whisper at the first sign of anger in the room. She is learning the same lesson I was taught, that survival depends on silence. And that is why I cannot allow the cycle to continue. I cannot let her carry the weight that has bent me for so long. Every memory of my childhood is a warning. Every scar, a reminder that children do not outgrow fear. They only learn to bury it until it shapes everything they become. My father's rage was inherited from his own father, I have no doubt. But it is my choice whether it stops here. As I sat on the reunion floor with Emma trembling against me, I knew the past had caught up with the present, colliding in one moment of violence. My father thought the chair would silence me again. Instead, it unlocked every buried memory and turned them into fuel. The cycle ends with me. I did not wake up one morning suddenly brave enough to face him. It took years of quiet preparation, years of writing things down when everyone told me to forget, years of saving photographs. I was told to delete, years of listening to my own doubt and choosing to act anyway. The first piece of evidence I ever kept was a hospital discharge paper from when I was 17. The doctor had written fractured rib consistent with blunt force trauma. My mother had stood beside me and told the nurse it was from falling down the stairs, her voice firm, her smile rehearsed, her hand clutching mine so tightly it felt like a threat. The nurse looked at me for confirmation. I remember shaking my head almost imperceptibly, but no words came out. I went home with bandages, painkillers, and a diagnosis buried beneath a lie. But I folded that paper and tucked it inside a book, hiding it like a secret weapon. Years later, I would retrieve it, proof that someone had known the truth, even if they had chosen not to say it aloud. After that, I began keeping everything. Every time he shouted threats over the phone, I saved the voicemail. Every time I showed up to school with a bruise, I took a photograph in the bathroom mirror, my hands shaking as I held the camera. I told myself I was crazy for doing it, paranoid, dramatic. That was what my mother always said, but something deep inside whispered that one day I would need it. When smartphones came, I recorded. Muffled shouting through walls, the slam of fists against doors, even the moment he threatened to kill the dog when it barked too loud. I labeled each file by date, stacked them in hidden folders, and backed them up where he could never reach. For a long time, I believed I was only protecting myself. But then Emma was born. I tried to be hopeful at first. I tried to believe he would soften, that he would treat her differently because she was innocent. But by the time she was 5, she had already begun to flinch at his voice. Once, when he shouted, she covered her head with her arms the way I used to. That night, I went home and opened my folder again. I added photographs of the bruise I saw on her wrist. I added the voicemail where he raged about how children needed to be toughened up. I began writing down what she said in her small voice lines that tore through me like glass. "Auntie, why does Grandpa get so angry when I laugh too loud? Auntie, is it bad if I feel scared when he hugs me?" These were not the questions a child should have to ask. My turning point came at a barbecue months before the reunion. Emma had knocked over a cup of soda on the patio. It splashed across my father's shoes. Without hesitation, he backhanded her across the cheek. She stumbled, stunned eyes wide with confusion and shame. Everyone saw, everyone froze. My mother rushed forward, not to comfort Emma, but to shush her, to hush the tears, to say it was an accident, and he did not mean it. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the plate I was holding. That night I swore I would never let it happen again. I called Robert. He listened as I described what happened. His sigh was long and tired, the sound of a man who had carried suspicion for too long. Then he said, "Enough. I will help you." Together, we compiled what I had into something undeniable. Photographs, medical records, recordings, even drawings Emma had made at school, where the figures had wide, angry mouths and tiny stick children cowering in corners. We passed them to Child Protective Services, a quiet submission that did not make a sound but carried the weight of every scream I had ever swallowed. I knew it might not be enough. I knew the system failed as often as it succeeded, but I also knew I had crossed a line. There was no returning to silence. When the invitation for the family reunion arrived, embossed and self-congratulatory as always, I felt my stomach twist. Yet I also felt clarity. This was where the facade would shatter. My father would drink. He would rage. And this time, there would be witnesses who could no longer claim ignorance. I tucked my folder into my bag not because I planned to wave it around, but because it gave me strength. It reminded me I was not crazy, not dramatic, not alone. Every page was a piece of my history he could no longer erase. And when the day came, when he lifted the chair and brought it crashing down on me in front of everyone, I knew that the years of gathering proof had led here. He thought he was proving his dominance. What he really did was prove my case. The reunion hall smelled of roast meat and spilled beer, but what lingered most was the silence after the chair came down. I still felt the ache in my ribs, the sting of glass pressed into my leg. Emma's arms wrapped tight around my waist, as if letting go would mean losing everything safe. My father stood there gripping the chair like a weapon he did not yet know how to set down. For a long moment, it seemed the room might snap back into its old rhythm, the excuses ready on lips, the murmured reassurances that he had gone too far but meant no harm. Then Robert's voice rose clear and sharp, the voice of someone who had spent decades refusing to speak and had finally chosen to. This is not the first time he said, and his words sliced through the heavy air. I treated her for broken ribs. I saw the bruises. I know what he has done. You all know what he has done. The murmur that usually followed such statements did not come. No one laughed it off. No one scolded him for causing a scene. Instead, all eyes shifted to him as if they had been waiting for permission to see what had always been in front of them. My father growled low, the sound of a cornered animal. "You shut your mouth, Robert. This is family business." Robert did not flinch. "No, this is violence, and today it stops." At that moment, the front door opened again and the CPS agent entered calm and steady. She carried a folder beneath her arm, her badge glinting in the light. The sight of her was a shockwave through the room. She was not family. She was not bound by loyalty or silence. She was law, and law did not bow to blood. "Sir," she said to my father, "put the chair down." He laughed harsh and cracked. "You people think you can walk into my house, into my family reunion, and tell me how to live." The agent's voice did not rise. She did not blink. "This is no longer about how you live. It is about how a child survives. Reports have been filed. Evidence has been gathered. And now we are here to protect Emma." The name hit the room like a hammer. Emma pressed her face into my chest, trembling. My mother finally rose, her voice sharp with desperation. "This is nonsense. He has his temper. Yes, but he loves his family. He provides. He works. He is under stress." She looked around for support, but no one spoke. Her words, once the blanket that covered every wound, now fluttered useless in the air. Robert stepped closer to her, his tone like ice. "You sat in waiting rooms while she was treated for injuries. You looked doctors in the eye and told them lies. You covered for him again and again. Not today. Not anymore." My father's grip on the chair loosened, then tightened again. His face was red, his teeth clenched. He muttered curses under his breath, his eyes darting toward me, toward Emma, toward the agent. He wanted to swing again, I could see it in his posture, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way the agent's hand hovered near her radio. Maybe it was the way Robert stood firm at her side. Maybe it was the fact that every relative's eyes were on him, no longer sliding away. Slowly, heavily, he lowered the chair to the floor. The sound of wood scraping tile was almost deafening. The agent nodded once. "Thank you. Now step back." He sneered, but obeyed, his chest still heaving. She turned to the room. "I will need statements from all of you." She looked at me, then her gaze steady, acknowledging without words that she knew this had been years in the making. My throat tightened, but I did not speak. I did not need to. The evidence was no longer hidden in folders. It was standing in plain sight. My mother whispered weakly, "Do not do this. Do not destroy us." Her eyes pleaded with me the same way they always had, asking me to carry the burden of silence so she would not have to. I held her gaze and for once did not bend. I had already made my choice. Emma stirred, her sobs softening into hiccups, her small hand gripping mine with surprising strength. I squeezed back, sending her a message without words. We are not alone. We are not powerless. The relatives shifted uneasily, some shaking their heads, some blinking back tears. They had spent years watching, pretending, excusing. Now they could not. The truth was on the table, raw and undeniable. The man they had called strong had lifted a chair against his own child. The woman they had called loyal had lied to shield him. And the child they had overlooked was clinging to me, terrified. For once, the picture could not be reframed. It was exactly what it was. The CPS agent raised her clipboard. "We have enough to proceed. Emma will be placed under protective supervision, effective immediately." My father shouted then a final desperate roar. "You cannot take her! She is mine!" His voice cracked, wild and trembling. The agent did not even raise her tone. She simply held up the document in her hand. "Emergency custody signed by a judge this morning. You will not be permitted contact until further notice." The words echoed through the hall like a verdict already handed down. Gasps rose from the crowd. My mother slumped back into her chair, her face pale, her lips pressed thin. No one defended him. No one said he was misunderstood. The silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of complicity. It was the silence of recognition, the silence that comes when a truth too large to deny finally crushes the lies that tried to contain it. I sat straighter despite the pain, holding Emma close. My father's eyes found mine full of fury and disbelief. "You did this!" he spat. For a heartbeat, I almost answered, almost explained. But I realized there was nothing to explain. I had not lifted the chair. I had not chosen violence. I had only refused to cover it anymore. So I stared back and let my silence be the answer. The reunion ended not with dessert or family photographs, but with flashing lights outside the hall, the arrival of officers who had been summoned by Robert's call. They spoke briefly with the CPS agent, then with me documenting everything as Emma clung to my side. My father barked and cursed, his voice cracking with rage, but when the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the sound that filled the room was not protest but relief. Some relatives turned away. Some whispered to each other, but no one stepped forward to defend him. For once, the old chorus of excuses did not rise. He was escorted out, his face twisted in disbelief, his eyes burning holes into mine, as if hatred could undo what had been done. I watched him go and felt my body tremble, not with fear, but with the weight of what was beginning. Because this was only the start. In the days that followed, statements were taken, reports were filed, and subpoenas were issued. My folder of evidence, once hidden in drawers and on hard drives, became official exhibits. Robert submitted his medical records. Neighbors spoke about the nights they had heard screaming through the walls. Emma's teachers provided notes about her withdrawn behavior, her sudden tears when voices were raised. It all assembled into a portrait of violence too detailed to deny. The courtroom was sterile and cold, but to me it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds I had lived under my whole life. I took my seat behind the prosecution table, Emma in protective custody, but safe Robert at my side. My father sat across the room, his hair combed, his suit pressed, his lawyer whispering in his ear. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, not physically, but in presence, stripped of the aura of dominance he carried in the house. Here, he was not the king of silence. He was just a man facing accountability. The judge entered stern and composed, and the trial began. The prosecution started with the X-rays. Images flickered onto the screen, grainy but clear, showing ribs cracked in jagged lines, a wrist bent where it should have been straight. The doctor who had treated me years ago testified. The injuries, he said, were not consistent with falls. They were consistent with blunt force impact. My father's lawyer objected, claimed the evidence was old, irrelevant, unreliable. The judge overruled. Then came the recordings, my voice small and trembling, his voice booming, shouting threats, the sound of a door slamming, of objects shattering, of a child's muffled sobs. The courtroom shifted, people exchanging glances, the weight of the audio undeniable. The defense tried to argue that the recordings were taken without consent, that they violated privacy, but the judge allowed them, inciting the necessity of evidence in cases of abuse. Next were the witnesses. Robert testified first, his voice steady. He spoke of treating me for injuries, of watching lies roll off my mother's tongue, of carrying suspicion for years until Emma's bruises forced him to act. My father glared at him, but Robert did not falter. Then neighbors took the stand. They spoke of nights interrupted by screams of walls that shook, of times they almost called the police, but did not because they thought it was not their business. Their shame hung heavy in the room, but their words added to the mountain of proof. Emma's teacher testified last. She described the pictures Emma had drawn: stick figures with wide open mouths and tiny children huddled in corners. She spoke of how Emma jumped when the classroom door slammed, how she whispered that she hated going home. When asked who made her afraid, she had written one word in shaky letters: Grandpa. The defense tried to paint Emma as imaginative, sensitive, easily influenced by me. But the teacher's steady voice, the sincerity of her concern, pierced through the attempt. Finally, it was my turn. I walked to the stand, my hands shaking but my spine straight. I swore to tell the truth, and for once I felt the weight of that oath not as a burden, but as a release. I spoke plainly, carefully. I recounted what I remembered, what I had documented. I did not embellish, I did not cry, I did not raise my voice. I laid out the years of fear, the pattern of violence, the silence that had suffocated me. The defense tried to rattle me. They asked why I had waited so long, why I had not spoken sooner, why I had returned for the reunion. I answered simply. Silence never protected me. Speaking out was the only way to protect her. I pointed toward the mention of Emma without needing her there. My final words were clear. I am not here to punish my father. I am here to protect his granddaughter. That was all. The courtroom was silent as I stepped down. The trial stretched on for days. Each piece of evidence, another stone added to the weight pressing down on him. His lawyer grew more desperate, his arguments thinner. He claimed stress drinking, bad childhood excuses worn thin with overuse. But the judge did not bend. When the verdict finally came, it was like the air shifted. Guilty of domestic assault, guilty of child endangerment, guilty of repeated violence. The sentence included prison time, mandatory counseling, a restraining order, and a permanent ban on unsupervised contact with Emma. My mother sat in the gallery, her face pale, her body rigid. She did not look at me. She did not speak to me. She left the courtroom as soon as the gavel struck her heels, tapping out a rhythm of denial. Some relatives cut ties immediately, their silence sharper than words. Others reached out quietly, sending messages of apology, of regret for never believing me. I did not respond to all, but I read each one. They were proof of how far the truth had spread. My father was escorted away in chains, his head bowed. He looked up at me once, his eyes full of the same disbelief he had worn at the reunion. He had always thought his power eternal, that silence would protect him forever. But silence had finally broken. The consequences were real. Not whispered, not hidden behind doors. And as I walked out of that courtroom, my ribs still aching, my scars still present, I felt lighter than I had in decades. Not healed, not whole, but free. For once the system had listened. For once the truth had been louder than his fists. When the trial ended and the sentence was handed down, I expected to feel triumph, but what I felt was exhaustion. It was as if years of carrying a secret weight had suddenly been set down, leaving my body shaky and hollow. I went home that night to an apartment that finally felt safe. The shadows on the walls were just shadows, not threats, and the quiet that filled the rooms was gentle, not suffocating. A week later, I was allowed to see Emma. She ran into my arms outside the CPS office, her backpack bouncing, her smile tentative but real. She whispered, "Am I safe now?" And I answered, "Yes, you are safe now. Not until tomorrow. Not until he calms down, but now and always." That moment mattered more than any verdict. We began to build a new rhythm together. She stayed with me more often, filling my apartment with small chaos crayons left on the table, stuffed animals lined up on the couch. We made pancakes on Saturdays, planted tomatoes in little pots by the window, and created a rule that at dinner no one raised their voice. At first, she flinched when I moved too quickly, but over time the flinches faded, replaced by laughter that spilled out of her like sunlight. The first time she hummed to herself while brushing her teeth, I stood in the doorway with tears in my eyes because it was proof that children can heal when fear is lifted. For myself, I sought therapy. I sat across from a woman with kind eyes and spoke of closets where I hid of water running in the tub to cover the sound of shouting of nights when I taped my own ribs. She listened without judgment and said the word trauma as if it was not shameful but factual. She told me survival had been my strength, but now living could be too. Slowly, I began to believe her. My scars did not vanish, but they no longer dictated every breath. With Emma, I practiced honesty. When she asked if I was scared in court, I said yes, but I went anyway. When she asked if I still hurt, I said sometimes, but healing takes time. I wanted her to know the truth, not the silence I had been given. One night, she called me Mom by accident. She froze, eyes wide, then whispered sorry. I pulled her close and told her she had nothing to apologize for. I understood what she meant. She was not confusing roles. She was naming safety. Over time, she began to draw pictures with bright colors, houses with open doors, figures smiling without jagged mouths. Each drawing was a kind of victory. The past still lingered, of course. There were relatives who refused to speak to me who muttered that I had destroyed the family, but others sent quiet messages of support, even apologies. One aunt wrote, "I should have listened years ago. I believe you now." I did not need their words, but I accepted them because each one was proof that silence was cracking beyond just my walls. The legacy was shifting. One evening, sitting on the balcony with Emma, she asked, "Do you think he misses me?" I thought carefully before answering. "I think he misses control, not you. That is not your fault." She nodded solemnly, a gesture older than her years, and leaned against me. We watched the stars in silence, but it was a silence filled with peace, not fear. That was when I realized what we were building. Not revenge, not a perfect picture of family, but a new legacy. One where truth mattered more than appearances, where safety outweighed tradition, where love did not require shrinking into shadows. My father's chair, the one he swung at me in front of everyone, was no longer just a weapon in my memory. It was evidence in a courtroom, a symbol of the end of his power. He thought it would break me, but instead, it became the proof that saved a child and freed me. His violence had once been our inheritance. Now our inheritance was courage. And as Emma curled against me whispering, "I love you," before sleep claimed her, I knew that would be the only legacy I chose to pass on. If you believe that truth matters more than silence, share this story, so others may find the strength to break their own cycles.